For 35 years, Alexander and I built a life together. A home filled with laughter, memories etched into photo albums, and even the joy of grandchildren who lit up our world. But somewhere along the way, we stopped living. The vibrancy of our early days faded into monotony. Our mornings were marked by silence as we sipped coffee at opposite ends of the table, our evenings spent side by side on the couch, but miles apart in spirit. Conversations became predictable scripts. "How was your day?" followed by polite nods or vague responses that neither of us truly heard. We weren't just growing older, we were growing distant. Two people sharing a house. Yes, but not hearts. One restless night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through social media while Alexander snored softly beside me. That's when I stumbled upon it, an online forum where couples discussed unconventional ways to rekindle their relationships. Partner swapping. At first glance, the idea seemed absurd, reckless even. Who would willingly invite such chaos into their marriage? Yet, something about it lingered in my mind like smoke after a fire. It wouldn't dissipate no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it. The next morning, over cold toast and lukewarm tea, I hesitated before bringing it up. "Alexander," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "what if there's another way to fix this?" He looked up from his newspaper, brow furrowed. When I explained what I'd read, he set it down slowly, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply staring at me as though trying to gauge whether I was serious. "Are you sure this is what we need?" he finally asked, his tone cautious, tinged with doubt. His words hung heavy between us, weighted with years of unspoken frustrations and fears. "I don't know," I admitted, meeting his gaze. My hands twisted nervously around the edge of my napkin. "But maybe breaking free of our routine will remind us why we fell in love in the first place. Maybe stepping outside ourselves could bring us back to each other." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though warding off an impending headache. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear of losing what little we had left versus the desperation to save it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Let's think about it," he said quietly, but carefully. And so, for weeks we deliberated. Nights stretched into endless discussions, arguments laced with vulnerability, and tentative agreements born out of sheer necessity. It wasn't easy. Neither of us wanted to admit that our marriage had reached a point where drastic measures felt necessary. But beneath the doubts and anxieties lay a flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent. Perhaps this act of rebellion against convention could reignite something long buried within us. Eventually, we agreed to take the leap. Through the same forum, we connected with another couple, Gregory and Olivia. Their profiles painted them as adventurous, open-minded individuals seeking the same renewal we craved. As messages exchanged between us grew more frequent, anticipation mingled with dread. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: staying stagnant wasn't an option. Not anymore. So, with trepidation gnawing at my chest and a fragile thread of optimism holding me together, I prepared to step into the unknown. Whatever happened next, I told myself, couldn't be worse than the quiet despair that had settled over our home like dust. The evening began awkwardly, the air thick with unspoken tension. Gregory moved around the room with an easy confidence, pouring wine into crystal glasses as though trying to fill the silence with something, anything, to ease the discomfort. His charm was undeniable, but it felt forced, like a performance meant to mask his own nerves. Beside him, Olivia sat perched on the edge of the couch, her fingers twisting together in her lap. She glanced at Gregory occasionally, her expression a mix of apprehension and quiet resolve, though she said little. Alexander and I exchanged glances across the room, our eyes meeting briefly before darting away. Neither of us spoke, but the question hung heavy between us. What have we done? The idea that had seemed so daring, so thrilling in theory, now felt reckless, even foolish. We were standing on the precipice of something we couldn't fully understand, let alone control. Yet there was no turning back. Not now. As the hours passed, however, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations started haltingly, with polite small talk about the weather, the cabin's rustic decor, anything safe and neutral. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the topics grew deeper. Someone mentioned work stress, another confessed a fear of aging. Before long, walls began to crumble. Words spilled out, raw, honest, vulnerable. Fears, desires, regrets, they tumbled into the open space between us, binding us together in ways none of us had anticipated. By the time dessert was served, a rich chocolate cake that no one really ate, we weren't just four strangers anymore. There was an electric charge in the air, anticipation buzzing beneath the surface. It wasn't just curiosity driving us forward, it was connection. For all our differences, we shared this moment, this fragile thread of humanity woven through shared vulnerability. When it came time to pair off, my heart raced as Gregory approached me. He held out his hand, his touch warm yet unfamiliar. I hesitated for only a second before taking it, letting him lead me to one of the bedrooms down the hall. Behind us, Alexander and Olivia disappeared into another room, their footsteps soft against the wooden floor. Being with Gregory felt surreal. His presence was intoxicating, charismatic, commanding, but also strange. Every brush of his fingers against my skin sent shivers down my spine, though not entirely from pleasure. It was exhilarating, yes, but also disorienting. His kisses were hesitant, almost reverent, as if he too was navigating uncharted territory. There was tenderness in his touch, a gentleness that surprised me. And yet, beneath it all lingered a nagging sense of wrongness, a reminder of how far outside the bounds of convention we had strayed. Meanwhile, in the other room, Alexander and Olivia connected on a different level. Their intimacy wasn't purely physical, it was emotional, profound. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden even from those closest to them. Olivia confessed her fears about motherhood, her doubts about whether she was ready for the life growing inside her. Alexander listened intently, his usual reserve melting away as he opened up about his guilt over past mistakes, his longing to be more present in our marriage. In each other, they found solace, understanding, and perhaps even redemption. Back in my room, Gregory paused, his gaze searching mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "It's different," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Different isn't always bad. And maybe he was right. As the night unfolded, the lines between excitement and unease blurred. What remained was a shared sense of discovery, of stepping into the unknown together. By the time dawn broke, none of us were the same people who had arrived at the cabin the night before. Whatever happened next, we knew one thing for certain: we couldn't go back to the way things were. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden streaks across the living room floor as Eleanor and Alexander reunited. Both looked tired but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders, though neither of them knew how fleeting that relief would be. "How was it?" Eleanor asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the mix of curiosity and apprehension swirling inside her. Alexander hesitated, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The gesture was so familiar, yet in this moment, he seemed like a stranger to her. Different, he finally replied, his tone measured but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Relief? But good. Olivia reminded me of how much I want to connect, not just physically, but emotionally. Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She wanted to ask more, to probe deeper into what he meant by different or good. But before she could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly together, as though trying to hold herself steady. "We need to talk," Olivia said, her voice trembling. It wasn't a request, it was an urgent plea. The air shifted instantly. Gregory, who had been leaning against the wall with arms crossed, straightened up, his sharp gaze locked onto Olivia, suspicion etched across his features. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his tone cutting through the fragile calm like a blade. Olivia hesitated, her lips parting as if searching for the right words. When they came, they tumbled out in a rush, raw and unfiltered. "I'm pregnant." The room froze. For a moment, there was only the sound of shallow breathing and the faint hum of the wind outside. Then Gregory erupted, his voice rising to fill the void. "You knew? And you didn't tell me?" "I was scared." Olivia cried, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice cracked under the weight of emotion. "I didn't know how to bring it up. Everything felt so complicated." Gregory stared at her, betrayal flashing in his eyes. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Complicated? You think keeping something like this from me is okay? How long have you known?" "Just a few days," Olivia stammered, shrinking back under his glare. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I swear. I didn't know what to do." As the tension between Gregory and Olivia escalated, another bombshell dropped. Alexander cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to silence everyone. "I know Olivia from my past." All eyes turned to him, confusion rippling through the room like a wave. Eleanor's heart sank, dread pooling in her stomach. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she managed to choke out, "What do you mean?" Alexander sighed, guilt etched across his face. He avoided meeting Eleanor's gaze, instead focusing on the floor as though it might offer some kind of escape. "Years ago, before we met, Olivia and I dated briefly. I ended things because I wasn't ready for commitment. When we saw her name on the forum, I recognized it, but thought, I don't know, I thought it would be fine." The room exploded into chaos. Gregory lunged toward Alexander, his face contorted with rage. "You lied to us. To me. How could you not say anything? It wasn't relevant." Alexander shot back, raising his hands defensively. "It was decades ago, a mistake I regretted. I never imagined it would come back to haunt us like this. Decades ago." Gregory spat, incredulous. "That doesn't change the fact that you kept it from me. From all of us." Eleanor stood frozen, overwhelmed by the revelations crashing down around her. The night that had started as an attempt to rekindle connection now felt like a house of cards collapsing. Secrets upon secrets, lies upon truths. It was too much to process. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she'd spent 35 years with and the stranger standing before her now. Through the storm of accusations and tears, Olivia's quiet sobbing cut through the noise. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We were supposed to fix things, not destroy them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Fix things? They had done the opposite, tearing open wounds they hadn't even realized existed. The intimacy they had sought to reclaim had instead exposed cracks in their foundations, widening them until the entire structure threatened to crumble. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it wavered with emotion. "How could one night unravel so many truths?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the question lingered unanswered, echoing in the silence that followed. No one spoke. The weight of what had been revealed pressed down on them all, suffocating in its enormity. Each person carried their own burden. Eleanor's shattered trust, Alexander's buried guilt, Olivia's fear of judgment, and Gregory's sense of betrayal. What had begun as an experiment in vulnerability had become a reckoning, a reminder that love, trust, and relationships are far more fragile than any of them had dared to admit. And as the sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the fractured pieces of their lives, none of them knew how, or if they could ever put it all back together again. In the days that followed, Eleanor and Alexander avoided speaking about the events of that night. The silence between them was heavy, not with anger, but with an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had done and what it had revealed about their marriage. It wasn't avoidance born of indifference. Rather, it felt like both were tiptoeing around something fragile, as if saying the words aloud might shatter whatever remained of their relationship. But the weight of the secrets pressed down on them, forcing cracks to form in their carefully constructed facade of normalcy. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. Alexander joined her, sliding into the chair across from her. His movements were deliberate, measured, as though he feared startling her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretch taut, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. "We almost destroyed everything," Eleanor said finally, her voice low and trembling with regret. She didn't look up, keeping her gaze fixed on the swirls of steam rising from her untouched tea. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "But we didn't," Alexander countered after a pause, his tone firm yet gentle. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And maybe that's the point. Maybe we needed to see how fragile trust can be, to realize how important it is." Eleanor raised her eyes to meet his, searching for some sign of blame or judgment. Instead, she found vulnerability, a mirror of her own conflicted emotions. "Do you really believe that?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or are you just trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense?" "I think I need to believe it," Alexander admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because if this, everything we've been through, was for nothing, then what does that say about us? About me?" His honesty caught her off guard, stirring something deep within her. She wanted to argue, to insist that none of it should have happened. But the truth was, she couldn't deny the way that single reckless decision had forced them to confront truths they'd buried beneath years of routine and complacency. They spent hours talking that night, peeling back layers of resentment and misunderstanding. They revisited old wounds, the arguments left unresolved, the dreams abandoned, the silences that had grown longer and heavier over time. For the first time in years, they truly listened to each other, not just hearing words, but understanding the pain behind them. "I miss who we used to be," Eleanor confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "I miss feeling like we were a team, like we could face anything together." "So do I," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was tentative, as though afraid she might pull away. When she didn't, he continued, "But maybe we can find our way back to that. Maybe we already have." Eleanor studied him, seeing glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who had promised to stand by her no matter what. The years had changed them both, worn them down in ways neither had fully acknowledged until now. Yet beneath the weight of their mistakes, there was still a spark, a flicker of hope that refused to die. "We've been given a second chance," Eleanor said, finally, her voice steadying. "Let's not waste it." Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Together," he agreed, the word carrying a weight that transcended its simplicity. It wasn't just a promise. It was a vow, a commitment to rebuild what they had nearly lost. Over the following weeks, they worked to mend the fractures in their marriage. Small gestures became acts of reconciliation. Alexander surprising Eleanor with her favorite flowers, Eleanor making coffee just the way he liked it. Conversations grew easier, less guarded, as they learned to navigate the new landscape of their relationship. There were moments of tension, reminders of the scars that would always remain. But they faced them together, choosing honesty over avoidance, connection over isolation. Yet even as their bond strengthened, it was complicated by the knowledge they carried. The memory of that night lingered like a shadow, a shared secret, binding them in ways neither fully understood. It wasn't guilt alone that weighed on them. It was the realization that their marriage had been saved not despite their transgression, but because of it. That thought was unsettling, even frightening, yet impossible to ignore. One evening, as they lay side by side in bed, the room bathed in soft moonlight, Eleanor turned to Alexander. "Do you ever wonder," she began hesitantly, "if we'll ever truly move past this, or if it will always be there?" Alexander was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe moving past it isn't the goal. Maybe it's about learning to live with it, to let it remind us of how far we've come." Eleanor considered his words, letting them settle over her like a bomb. She didn't have an answer, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of peace, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps they could find their way forward together. As sleep claimed them, their hands intertwined, Eleanor realized that their journey was far from over. Their marriage was no longer the pristine structure it had once been. It was scarred, imperfect, and deeply human, but it was theirs. And for now, that was enough. Love isn't static. It evolves, wavers, and sometimes falters. What Alexander and I did wasn't conventional. Far from it, but it forced us to confront the cracks in our foundation, the ones we had ignored for far too long. There's no denying that what happened between us was reckless, even selfish. Yet, as I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I realize it wasn't just about the act itself. It was about what it revealed, how fragile trust can be, how easily intimacy can slip through our fingers if we're not careful. And yet, it also showed me something else, something unexpected. Even after years of drifting apart, love has a way of finding its footing again, like roots stretching deep into the earth after a storm. Would I recommend this path to others? No, absolutely not. Every relationship is unique, shaped by its own history, challenges, and dynamics. What worked, or rather, what ultimately saved us, might destroy another couple. But for us, it became a turning point, a moment when we could no longer avoid the truths we buried beneath layers of routine and silence. It reminded me that even after decades together, there are still discoveries to be made, still ways to rediscover each other. Trust, jealousy, loyalty, they're all threads in the tapestry of love. Sometimes those threads fray under pressure, worn thin by neglect or misunderstanding. But with effort, patience, and honesty, they can be rewoven into something stronger, more resilient than before. That's what Alexander and I have been doing these past weeks. Weaving. Slowly, carefully, we've been piecing together the fragments of our marriage, mending what broke while embracing the imperfections that make us human. As Alexander and I sit together now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I feel a sense of peace I haven't felt in years. The air is cool against my skin, and the quiet hum of nature surrounds us. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. His hand finds mine, his touch warm and steady, and I squeeze it gently, grateful for the unspoken connection between us. We don't need words right now. The silence says enough. I glance at him, taking in the lines on his face, the silver streaks in his hair, the calmness in his eyes. He's changed over the years, just as I have, but there's a familiarity in his presence that feels like home. For so long, I thought love meant never losing sight of each other, never letting life pull you in separate directions. Now, I understand that love is also about finding your way back when you do drift apart. It's messy, imperfect, and often painful, but it's worth fighting for. The journey ahead won't be easy. There will be moments of doubt, times when old fears resurface or new challenges arise. But sitting here beside him, feeling the weight of his hand in mine, I know we'll face them together. Not because we're perfect, but because we've chosen to keep trying, to keep choosing each other day after day. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Love isn't about avoiding mistakes or protecting yourself from pain. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, and choosing to rebuild what matters most. As the last rays of sunlight fade behind the horizon, I lean my head against Alexander's shoulder, letting the warmth of the moment settle over me. For the first time in a long while, I feel hopeful, not just for us, but for the resilience of love itself.